I think we can get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see a packed room for this session. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and their elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge the unceded lands in which we may be listening from, and that sovereignty was not ceded and struggle for self-determination is ongoing. My name is Heba Adawy, and I'm a policy officer at Volunteering Australia, and I'm also a facilitator for today's session. I also want to add that at Volunteering Australia, we run an Indigenous policy and practice working group, which is basically an opportunity for people who are interested in this space to come to convene every 2 months and share their insights. For those of you who are interested, please stay in touch. So as you know, this session is on First Nations volunteering and/or community practices differentially conceived or articulated. I won't say too much on that because I want to let my presenters unpack that for us. But I do want to open this session by foregrounding the importance of adopting a decolonial lens to our engagement on First Nations advocacy and research, and to use this opportunity to learn as well as unlearn. And that's something that I've also been doing as a non-Indigenous person working within this space. So we have our presenters, our lovely presenters with us. We have Aimee Bacchetto, is one of the volunteer coordinators of Community First Development, and she's been working there since 2019. She is also a volunteer at her son's community kindy as the grants coordinator and also works as a science teacher at a state school in Queensland. Then we have Ginibi Robinson, who's a Bundjalung Nation woman, and she is also a senior project manager at Community First Development and has also served as a visiting fellow at the Center of Aboriginal Economic Policy Research. And finally, we have Jenna Chia, who is a senior engagement officer at Volunteering Victoria, and she works extensively on First Nations community engagement and has also worked towards developing the Reconciliation Action Plan. So we'll have about 15 minutes of presentation followed by question and answer, and we want to leave enough time for question and answer. But before we move to the formal presentations, I want to turn the mic back to our presenters, and I would like them to speak a little bit about their organization, either their organization or a little bit on their positionality within First Nations research and advocacy space. So yeah, I will hand this over to you.
So good afternoon. I am Aimee Bacchetto. I would firstly like to acknowledge the lands that we are standing on today, the Ngunnawal Ngambri lands, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that acknowledgement to the people watching from the different lands that you are on today. I will introduce myself and then Ginibi will do a bit more of a formal acknowledgement as well. So I am the volunteer coordinator, or one of the volunteer coordinators with Community First Development. I, as a non-First Nations person, am privileged to walk along the journey with our volunteers, majority of whom are also do not identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. I'm very privileged to support our volunteers as we work alongside communities all around Australia. So we'll go into a bit more detail about who we are, our organisation, shortly, but I'll pass over to Ginibi to introduce herself.
So I can, before I do that, I'll formally just acknowledge country for us. Jingiwala, Ngunnawal, Ngambri, Julgan, Bugube. In my language, I'm saying hello to country and giving my love and gratefulness to Ngunnawal Ngambri country that I've had the privilege of working and living on for on and off 20 years. I'm a Githable woman from the Bundjalung language group, nation, and grew up on Gadigal country in Sydney and then Kaurna country in Adelaide, where we have extended family with the Nudgee mob down there, and moved over this way in around, I think it was 2001 from memory. My background, I've mainly worked in the Aboriginal community controlled sector in Canberra, quite a bit in government, and then I've been with Community First Development for almost a year, leave without pay from ACT government. I'm extremely privileged to connect with deadly people like Aimee within our organisation, who are doing some amazing work in making sure that our volunteers are culturally grounded, work in culturally safe ways, and work with our community in self-determining ways. And we'll talk about that as part of our presentation. Today is the anniversary of the apology, and I just want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that it's 15 years since Kevin Rudd apologised to the stolen generations and their descendants. And I want to acknowledge those stolen generations mob who have survived, who are still here, those who have gone, and their descendants. I want to acknowledge those who have come home, those who fought hard to come home, those who came home and couldn't come home, those who came home and felt they didn't know where they belonged, and those who are still searching for home. And I think that's really important in the work that everybody does in any organisation you're connected to, is to sit with those stories. I know for my family, the trauma has passed down, and I want to acknowledge also the strength and resilience of my grandfather, my mother, and my sister, who were all impacted by those policies. So just a bit about these photos, because they're not your typical, you know, sort of photos. So the one of Aimee is from some work that we did with one of our, I guess, organisations that we work with last year up at Larapinta. And Aimee was one of our staff members who went up there and connected with the mob up there as part of walking the Larapinta Trail. And the photo of me is with my actual, one of my volunteer hats on. I'm the community engagement officer with my local RFS brigade, so Captain's Flat, which is where I live on Yarrago country. And that photo is a bit of a, I'm a bit deadly because we were called to a car fire which was impacting on the local bush, and there were two of us who responded and we got it out. So that photo is a bit of a, oh my God, we did it. I also want to acknowledge the unseen work that a lot of our people do in the, what we don't call in our community volunteering. So I volunteer with the RFS because it's my obligation to country. It's my obligation to the country that's nurtured and looked after me. It's not because it's not for a formal volunteering kind of thing. It's because I have a cultural obligation to that country, and this was a way of giving back to that country. So, a bit about community first development, otherwise I'll just talk forever. So, who are we? We're a First Nations, I'm just going to get rid of all these bits of paper. We're a First Nations-led community development and research organisation. We've been around for about 20 years, and we connect with our communities nationally, with businesses, with organisations and around the country, and also with skilled volunteers to achieve community dreams, community goals. Everything we do is community driven, so it's 100% community owned. Every project is community owned, community driven. Communities have a say in every aspect of every project from the very start. So from their connect with us to the very end. Everything is by invitation only. So communities also, and Aimee will talk more about the relationship between volunteers, communities and our community development officers. But communities have a say in who comes onto community, what kind of cultural protocols need to be engaged with, the time that the relationship may take. So every element is around community needs and self-determined by communities, and that's really important to us. It's around being with communities. So a real big change from the old ways of working, particularly with First Nations communities, which was around doing to and doing for. Our value was around being with, doing with, and communities leading every element of the project. Communities also design their own monitoring around projects. So what will success look like to a community depends on the community and what the community believes is the outcome that they want to have. So we will walk with the community around that as well. So where we work, we've got offices, all those little dots on the map there. That's basically where we have offices, and then our community development officers based in all of those regions work out across the country basically. The only two jurisdictions we don't have current projects in at the moment are South Australia and Tasmania. And the other little diagram there is about the types of projects. So we work across urban, regional and remote areas. So the diversity of our communities as well is represented. So for me, and this was one of the reasons I actually applied for the role with Community First Development, was around self-determination. So our communities being self-determining is a fundamental value of our organisation. Communities have a say, as I said before, from the very start, inviting us in to their communities, and then they actually will then tell us what they need, what they want, what their dreams are, and then we will work with communities around achieving that or changing it. So in the work that I do a lot of the community development stories and reporting, and sometimes our communities will go, well, we think we want to go in this direction, and then they'll change and they'll go, no, we actually want to go here. And for some of our funders and philanthropic supporters, that can be a bit of a, oh, well, hang on a minute, you know, you said you were going to do this and now you're doing that. And for us, it's actually about, this is the community's story, this is the community's dream, and we will support the community in doing that because the community has gone, well, actually, we need to do something else first. And so we will work with a community around their dream in that space. So we've just got a little video which actually gives a bit of more of an idea, hearing from some of the communities we've worked with and also our CEO around this key element of how we work, self-determination. Just about to pass over to Aimee to do what I call the deadly stuff, which is about the real work that's happening out in communities and that really important connection between communities, our community development officers and volunteers. But before I pass over, we work to this framework, and this framework has been developed by us, and in particular by the work that's been done over the past 20 years with our community development officers and with communities. And this sort of frames our whole way of being in our engagement with communities. So it's around connecting, listening, and a lot of it is deep listening and coming back, taking the time, and I think that's an incredibly important part, is taking the time and sitting with what a community actually is telling you, rather than coming in with a set of expectations and assumptions about what is needed. So we take the time throughout the whole process, and I think for me, one of the other things that is a highlight with this framework is that you can keep coming back to different elements of it. So even though it's a circular motion, you might go to sort of reflect and celebrate because there's been something absolutely deadly that's happened in the community, and everybody just wants to, you know, do a, oh my God, that is so good. And then you'll come back to the connect and build. So what is this project going to look like for us? And then a community might go away and have a think about it and then come back. So it's about always that two-way, but being really flexible in the approach and the process. So it's not necessarily about the outcome, like I said before, about our expectations about what we think may or may not happen. It's about the process and the journey and the time and the relationship with communities.
Yeah. Thanks, Ginibi. So if we go, yeah. Perfect. So I'll talk a bit more about that relationship and the process between our staff, our community partners and our volunteers. It is very much a three-way partnership with communities leading the way. So it's all a bit hypothetical when we stand here and talk about our frameworks and the way we work. So I'll give you a bit of information without going into too much detail about outcomes because they really are communities' stories to share. I will give some an outline of the kinds of projects that we can do. So each project is very different depending on the unique goals of the communities, and it is the communities that invite us and share those goals with us. And as Ginibi mentioned, we can support as much or as little as needed to shape those goals and figure out the next steps with communities, all the while with community leading the way. We can do things such as business or strategic planning with communities. It could be setting up community groups doing sewing projects or skill building in handyman jobs or, building capacity around carpentry or getting things done around community, right through to setting up a website development as a few examples. Supporting communities to apply for and acquit grant applications is another example that we see coming up a fair bit. So even though each goal is different and each community is different, we do notice there are some commonalities between some of the things that communities may be reaching out that we can support with. We currently have 250 volunteers on our books, but we've worked very much project-based, as I'm sure that's becoming clear. So not all those volunteers will be working on a project at one go, and it's not an ongoing commitment. It is very much working with the communities to support them to achieve their goals. The amount of time can be really varied, and COVID has certainly impacted the way that we are able to engage with communities. So it may be that a volunteer will go to community for a few days up to a couple of weeks, get to know that community, really understand their goals, and then they may be able to support remotely through technology to progress a project further. That's something that was a model that we had worked with to some degree before COVID, but COVID has certainly shifted the way that we are able to do that, the way that volunteers are reactive and responsive to working in that way, and similarly the way community is as well. So that should give you a little bit of an idea of the breadth of work that we can do, hopefully, but if there's any questions at the end, we're more than happy to answer. It's very much skilled volunteering. So business planning, website development, it really is. We're relying on skilled volunteers to support us, but it is more than just the skill. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is the relationship that our volunteers build with communities and the impact that that can have. So it is more than the skill that matters, it's about the connection that's built. So Devon is a community partner that we've worked with quite a few years now. He works for the Aboriginal Men's Healing Centre over in Western Australia. So on our next slide, we have a quote from Devon. Yeah. I was thinking, am I giving you hints to move? So, that's okay. I've got the quote in front of me, so I will read it out to you. So, to have access to the specialist Community First Development has provided to AMHC is the most humbling experience one can have. To work with people that are generous in nature is an experience we shall never forget. So, not once in Devon's quote there has he mentioned the skills that are brought forward or given any indication that it's transactional between the volunteer and the community. It is really about the relationships that are built along the way. Hopefully we'll be able to get up. We've got one more video which talks a little bit about the volunteer experience from two of our volunteers who both coincidentally are Canberra based, Deb and Anthony. Really different skills. So Anthony works in business development and mentors communities with business development, and Deb is an IT whiz, so she's set up many websites for communities.
That's way to be stuck, but that's not an issue. Wait for the IT support to come in a bit.
So the reason we popped that video in about self-determination and the video we hope to share with you, hearing the volunteers' experience, is because lived experience is so important. It's so important to hear from the people that we are talking about and working alongside. When we hear this video, which we will, again, similar to Devon's quote, it's really about the experience of building connections and the relationships that are built over time. So I could tell you many a story about our volunteers, and I may just time fill and tell you one. No, one of our volunteers who has recently retired, and we're looking forward to celebrating his contributions next week at an event. Perfect, so it's just one slide over. He volunteered with us 15 years ago and still is in contact with the community he first worked with 15 years ago. He still does their accountancy work outside of the work of community first development. But here we have Deb and Anthony sharing their experience with us.
Apart from just making great friends that are really, I'd call family now, and great places I'd go back to visit anytime. I think I've learnt so much about different groups, cultures. Going with community first development by an invitation of the community means so much more than at the time it kind of might feel frustrating, you have to wait to go, but that the community has invited you to come, it means a lot when you actually arrive.
Every group, every organisation, every community is different, and so it's so important to take that time to get to know them and their community and what their needs are. No project is the same, no community is the same, and it's that's what's really special about doing this kind of work, is getting to see the beautiful parts of this great country, but also getting to meet the individuals and communities out there and seeing what we can do to give back.
So Deb explained a little bit about that it can be frustrating waiting to be invited to go to community. So that's one crucial way to the way that we work and the way that self-determination is really embedded throughout the entire process, is that communities have control of which volunteer they would like matched to their project. So our staff do a really good job of shortlisting volunteers based on the skills that they have, based on conversations with those volunteers, and then it's communities that can make an informed decision about who they feel most comfortable working alongside on their project. The volunteers who get it, it's wonderful, but that is a point of difference for the way that we work. That is often explaining and re-explaining to some of our volunteers, and that leads me into talking a little bit about how we prepare our volunteers to work with communities. So, which is a really important part to the way we work, into making sure that it's a culturally safe space for the communities that we are working with, and the way that our values as our organisation, our framework, and that self-determination is core to the work we do. There's a lot of training that needs to be involved to support our volunteers on that learning journey. We have gone through a consultation process that it's been quite intensive over the last 12 months, learning about what matters to community, what they want from volunteers, and what qualities in the volunteers they find important. So we have up here a few things that stand out to me: walking alongside us, shares their own stories, respects culture, and builds genuine relationships. We've tried to take the learning of our communities and the learning of our volunteers as well to think about what does that look like? How can we prepare volunteers to work respectfully alongside communities? And it's been a journey. Ginibi's been alongside me on this journey. And I think we've got our next slide. We've got a picture of a volunteer, Marion, who does it well. It started with an online learning course, which has been through COVID, which explains the way that we work and our organisation. And we're very excited this year to be launching our face-to-face inductions, which we've done over the last 12 months, have been redeveloping the content for that. The way that we prepare volunteers will look different in different areas. We have done a lot of focus on localising information where we can, because we know that each community is different and unique. So that's an important learning that will come through in our inductions with our volunteers. But it's also been about challenging your own worldviews, challenging your biases, and looking and taking the time to think about, what does listening and understanding look like? How can I go as a volunteer into a community, respectfully understand what they are looking for and work alongside those communities in a way that is valuing, respecting, acknowledging and embodying self-determination for community, so they are leading throughout the whole way. We're looking forward to launching our inductions this year, but the process of getting to that point of developing these inductions has been really exciting. It's been a privilege for me as a non-First Nations person to learn from communities, to learn from our volunteers about how we can support them best to work alongside communities. And hopefully we'll have some learnings to share if you follow along with us on our journey, because we're really looking forward to re-engaging in person and being able to continue our work with communities. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jenna, Chia, and I'm the Senior Engagement and Indigenous Programs Officer at Volunteering Victoria. It was so wonderful to hear. I never can hear enough about Community First Development's approach, because I think they're just leading the way in this area, and it was such a pleasure to work with them on our particular project too. I'm a non-Indigenous woman from colonial settler heritage, and I strive to be a First Nations ally as much as I can, and that's an ongoing journey. I would like to also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the really long and strong history of community giving in First Nations communities. And I think as a volunteer sector, we have an enormous amount to learn from them. I'm going to juggle a few things. So today I'm going to talk about the project that I worked on over 2021 to 2022, which was exploring First Nations community giving in Gippsland. The project was funded through the Department of Social Services VMA1 funding, and this funding aimed for the recipients of the funding to transition to a new funding model, as many of you would be aware, that was aimed at breaking down barriers to volunteering for, among others, First Nations communities. That'd be amazing, thank you. So in terms of our positionality, receiving this funding really led us to reflect on our position as a volunteering peak body. And some of these reflections, and we had started this process through the development of our Reconciliation Action Plan and a position statement around First Nations community giving, where we really acknowledged that already occurred and the incredible value of that. These reflections led us to think about that formal volunteering is a very Western concept, that the volunteer sector, while often or almost always very well intentioned, does pose many structural barriers to participation for First Nations communities. And that charities and not-for-profits do have quite a challenging history of perpetuating harm against First Nations community and being active participants in their marginalisation, and that's something that we do have to grapple with. Through the process, even early discussions of talking with diverse communities and First Nations communities, it became apparent really quickly that community giving occurs across all communities in various forms, and that it really supports these communities to thrive. So reflecting led us to more questions, as good reflection often does, and that was that Some of those questions were, how do First Nations communities support each other, and what do those practices of unpaid community giving look like? And we really didn't know. That was a huge gap in our knowledge. Do First Nations communities want to volunteer in the formal Western sense in non-Indigenous organisations? We had our doubts, but we really wanted to explore that with community. As a non-Indigenous organisation, are we best placed to be doing this work, and what can our role be? And how can we be an ally to First Nations communities, and as a peak body provide leadership to the volunteer sector around inclusion and being an ally? Thank you. So in these reflections and questions, I've covered them a lot because they really helped inform our project design, along with the work of Community First Development and their framework, and some early discussions that we had with Steph, the CEO. And while we weren't able to sort of follow that model because we're a non-Indigenous organisation, because of funding arrangements that were difficult to navigate, it did really help inform it. So what we wanted to do was use the funding we'd received to provide a platform for the voices of First Nations communities. Where possible, we wanted to have a project that hopefully provided some benefits to the community. We wanted to develop, from our perspective, a better understanding of community giving. And we really wanted to provide, we were required to provide a report back to government, and we really wanted that report to, again, elevate the voice of the First Nations community in Gippsland and provide feedback about what was happening in the strengths and resilience of community as well, and what their priorities were. Thank you. So the project underwent a few changes. It was over still the COVID-19 pandemic, and we needed to be responsive to community need and to be flexible and adaptable. And I'll talk more to that later around our organisational learnings. But in the end, we adapted it to be an exploratory sort of project where we engage community members more broadly in a series of yarn-ups, just asking them how they supported community. And obviously we brought our lens to it. People knew the name of our organisation, so volunteering, the word volunteering often came into it, and we were aware that we were bringing that to the table. So I'm going to cover a few of the themes, thank you, today. Oh, sorry, back one, yeah. So the first area that came up and that we really wanted to learn about was how does the community practice community giving? And the participants in the yarn-ups described unpaid community contribution and supporting their fellow communities as something that was intrinsic to their culture and everyday lives. It wasn't a separate activity. It was just part of who they were and part of how they lived in community. They also described a deep sense of obligation and a commitment to supporting each other. And this was often linked to a commitment to justice and equity and ensuring everyone had a fair go and was supported and had opportunities. Contributing to community and giving their time for free was not seen as volunteering at all, as per the Western sort of definition of it. And also none of the community members that that we spoke to volunteered in non-Indigenous organisations. There were many reasons for this, and they also weren't motivated to, which I'll speak more about later. So in the words of the participants, thank you, these were some of the quotes. When you're doing things for community, you don't realise you're volunteering. You're just happy to do it without any question. You just say, yeah, I'll put my hand up. And from someone else, you know that you should do it, and if you don't do it, other people will, and it always gets done. But you want to make sure it's shared and everyone is doing their bit. We'd all rather help out than not see it not get done. And I think that really speaks to the how reciprocal community giving is, that it's a shared practice, and there's no one that doesn't do it, and there's no one that misses out from it either. The second thing was around the strengths and values of community giving, and there were so many benefits that the community described, but some of the key ones were how it fostered care and support for each other and really kept the community connected, particularly in times of difficulty. It ensured community members were supported during sort of crises, and there were so many examples given related to the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters in the area, and even cost of living pressures that were really having a huge impact on community, particularly in Gippsland, where it's a very, large regional area and the cost of petrol is high, and community really came together to support each other during those times. Community very much saw community giving, as I mentioned, in terms of equity and justice as a way of addressing systemic disadvantage and inequality, and also addressing gaps in services and funding. It also enabled them to develop opportunities and programs to address those needs that were self-determined. And people spoke a lot about that, how that while gaps in funding were problematic, that actually the gap meant that they had more autonomy and more determination over the initiatives that they came up with. So a quote from a participant was, we don't just have access to additional funding. If crises happen, that becomes the priority, and we do what we need to do in our own time. We joke that our job isn't 9 to 5, and it's true. We're giving all the time and it never stops for community. We do it because we don't want people to miss out. Some people have more opportunities than others, but it doesn't mean they should miss out. Going back to culture is just something you do. You share with each other and make sure that everyone gets a hand up and a step up. It's the equality we want in the community. So I am going to touch on the issues and barriers that were raised briefly, but before I do, I do want to say that the focus of the yarn-ups was very much on the strengths and resilience of community and the way they supported each other. However, community did also identify some issues that came up for them, and that was in relation to both cultural practices of community giving and, in a hypothetical sense, around barriers to formal volunteering, although, as I said, it wasn't necessarily a motivation. It was more like, if I were to think about volunteering in that sense, this is what would concern me. So while community giving was able to address gaps in funding and services and enabled those self-determined solutions, community spoke about how this sometimes meant that those gaps were overlooked, that government wasn't aware, and that it also essentially gave them an excuse not to do too much about it. So there were concerns about the funding and resourcing gaps. There were also concerns that it places a huge burden on community, that they are never really, clocking off or having a lot of their own free time, and that this led to exhaustion and burnout. And this was particularly a concern, and it was predominantly younger members of the community that we engaged with, but they spoke a lot about their concern for elders in the community, and the expectations on them to provide sort of free cultural learning and education and ceremonies, and how this really impacted the wellbeing of elders. In regards to formal volunteering, so participants talked about how systemic inequalities did actually impact their ability to engage with community-controlled organisations who still require screening processes and police checks. So the higher levels of incarceration rates impacted that and meant that people couldn't always be involved in, their children's school activities or kinder activities because of those requirements, and that really posed a barrier to community participation more broadly. And while there was no preference to volunteering non-Indigenous organisations, people did talk about microaggressions and discrimination and how this concerned them and would worry them in terms of engaging with non-Indigenous organisations. So in relation to the impact, and this was particularly around the higher levels of incarceration rates, someone said it has a huge effect in getting parents involved in their early years. They might want to help out with what their kids are doing, but the minute they have a criminal record, bang, they can't always volunteer, which means they can't be involved with what their kids are doing. And in regards to the discrimination and microaggressions, you worry about how you'll be treated or how people will look at you. It's just the worry of that sort of stuff. It's not racism. Us, as an Aboriginal community, a lot of us, we're scared of the looks that people give us and the comments. So there's a few, for me, key messages that came across through our project, and that's that First Nations community members in Gippsland participate in constant and sustained community giving within their communities. They support each other to address inequities and community need and to provide opportunities for each other. However, this does consume much of their free time and energy, and while it is an incredible strength of community and testament to their resilience, it does place a significant burden on community members in the absence of appropriate funding and resources. So we developed from these themes a set of policy and practice implications. Now, a limitation of obviously our project was that it was very time limited. We did not have time to consult with community members around the implications, so they're not framed as specific recommendations, and they are very broad and general in nature. They're very much focused on, established principles around self-determination and some general guidance on how we as non-Indigenous organisations and how government can address barriers, systemic barriers that we pose to First Nations communities. Yeah. So I'll touch very quickly just on our organisational learnings as a non-Indigenous organisation. The key one was the need for long-term commitment to developing relationships with First Nations communities. That's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen even in a year. It really takes showing up time and time again and building that trust. The need for self-determination, co-design and community investment, and we could certainly not have completed this project without the involvement of Community First Development and Gippsland and East Gippsland Aboriginal Cooperative. The need for flexibility and adaptability. So as I mentioned, the project took a few iterations. The first one that was going to be a participatory sort of exercise with a community controlled organisation to help them sort of understand community giving, and due to the pressures on health services from the pandemic, we did have to adapt that and take more responsibility for the sort of report writing and that sort of thing. The other thing I'll quickly mention is the need to appropriately value and remunerate people for their time, particularly because we were asking community to support our cultural learning, and so we part of the design of the project was that we were going to remunerate any participants for their time and to allow adequate time to reflect as staff, for staff to reflect on all of this. That's it. So just again, acknowledging and particularly our incredible community participants who showed up and were so generous in sharing their knowledge.
Okay, thank you so much, Jenna, and all our participants, Aimee and Ginibi. So we're going to move straight to the questions. Maybe we can take a round of 3 questions and then move back to our panelists. So 3 questions at a time. Anyone? Okay.
Hi, I'm Chris Blake from St John Ambulance over in WA. I'm head of community engagement there. And we're looking at currently starting a project which is to move into First Nations communities which are very, very remote and support and try to find out what support they might need from us before an ambulance arrives. So whether that's first aid and how they do sort of blending both sort of Western medicine and First Nations medicine to really complement the community and for us to be able to support and help. And I just wondered what tips you might give with regards to starting those conversations and how we might be able to, you know, make sure that we're respectfully doing that.
So we'll take, if there are any more questions, we'll take a round of 3. Any more? Okay. Okay, I think we can go with the first 2.
Just in relation to the St John's question, probably I'd be yarning up with the Aboriginal Community Health Service in the particular region and asking, is that something that the community actually wants? That's your first port of call. Also noting that communities have a lot of people constantly coming to them and asking for input. So cultural load is huge. And also knowing those communities, you know, up in remote WA are also really severely impacted by the floods at the moment. So there's a lot of stress in those communities. So thinking about timing is really important. Me personally, having just come off several flood deployments and seeing the impact on our communities in Western New South Wales and in Victoria, now is probably not a good time to connect with those communities because the priority will be around, do people actually have a home to go back to? Can people go home? There's a lot of homelessness at the moment as a result of the floods across the country. But yeah, asking the key people in the community, so health services obviously because, you know, you're a health agency, having those yarns and then taking the time. So if you don't get a response immediately, that's okay. You know, going back and having another conversation at another time maybe. Just putting your feelers out.
Ginibi, I was going to say the same thing just around the consultation with our inductions. It's been, you know, we didn't get as many responses to start as we would have liked, and it was a busy period. It was around NAIDOC that we started asking the questions, which in hindsight was not great. You know, so it's a starting point, and it's, if you don't get the responses you need, it's ongoing learning. It is an ongoing process, and the opinions of communities are so diverse as well. So it's, for us, we've built into our monitoring and evaluating of the successfulness of and the impact of our induction program. We have our own monitoring and evaluating processes that we will use to continue our learning, so that we don't just sit still and be happy with what we've done. We've consulted, end of story, you tick that box. It's ongoing learning, and it's continually adapting to meet the needs of the communities we're working with.
Yeah, I'll just touch on the question around the expectations on elders, although if Ginibi would like to add anything from her perspective, I'd love to hear that too. So speaking to what the participants told us, and as I said, they were generally younger members of the community, they just talked about how really there's a lot of expectation on elders, both from within the community, so cultural expectations on the advice and the support they give to the community, that they're more than happy to do, but that it's also a burden, and that often the health of elders is not great. But particularly then there's also expectations from non-Indigenous organisations. They talked specifically a little bit about local councils as well, expecting elders to come and provide, you know, cultural learning or education, or to turn up to, you know, NAIDOC week ceremonies, council NAIDOC week ceremonies, when that is, you know, a hugely busy week for them in their own community, but they're expecting them to sort of turn up without pay, without any remuneration. And that is a constant pressure that seems to, really impact their well-being as well. I don't know if you've got anything to add from your perspective?
That's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think cultural load is massive, and our older generation carry that, and particularly after, I'm talking from the local community I know, and from my own family, so, you know, I'm not speaking for every Aboriginal community or Torres Strait Islander community. But since the bushfires, the 2019-2020 bushfires, COVID, the floods, lockdowns, sorry business, our older people, our elders, and our young people are actually carrying huge amounts. And I think being respectful of that. There's a wave within mainstream Australia. All of a sudden, it's like mainstream Australia has woken up to the fact that the oldest living cultures in the world are here. And so over the last decade, I've suddenly seen this, oh, we want to engage, we want to connect, we want to come to NAIDOC, we want to do this, we want to do that. Oh, can you come and do this? Can you come and do a welcome? Can you come and do the flag raising? Oh, we'd love to have a weaving. Can you take us out bush? Can you teach us how to do cultural fire? Like all of a sudden this, do you know your language? How come you don't know your language? Why don't you know your language? Why aren't you regenerating your language? All of these things are happening, and that's a load on our communities on top of dealing with the generations of trauma of fighting every day still in a colonial system and dealing with everyday experiences of racism. So I think being really aware of that added burden, particularly for our older people who have gone through the hard times.
Thank you. So we have two questions here. If you could speak in the mic, then our online audience would be able to hear.
Sorry, I just saw something I just wanted to ask everyone, and just a bit of reflection. As a trans First Nations woman from Stolen Generation, how, I guess it's for everybody listening too, sometimes people have a idea of what an Indigenous person looks like, and I always get questions like, oh, where are you from? And then when I try to explain, I was born in '68 and from Stolen Generation, it is traumatic to have to keep telling my story. And I just wanted people to be aware that when you have forms and stuff and you want to engage with First Nations communities, that you're very mindful and respectful that it is very for some of us, it's still a journey. You know, I didn't find out till I was in my late 40s. I'm still trying to find my way home. It's very hard, but it's sometimes, I do a lot of volunteer work and I'm in the academic space, and to always be questioned, oh, why don't you know yet? Why don't you? And there's so many times it's difficult, it's personal, but I just wanted to ask, I guess, the panel, what do you see? How is the best way for an organisation who want to embrace First Nations people into these spaces, your ideas about forms and asking the identity? Because I guess it's a question, but I think it's important. Perhaps people need, from my own experience, I have found it very traumatizing when I'm constantly being asked and I'm looked at, oh, you're very white-skinned, and I have to almost, you know, it's like I'm having to explain, I'm trans, I'm disabled, I'm old, and yes, this is who I am. Thank you.
We have one comment or question here. Yeah. Here. Yes.
Terrific. One quick question. How do we help volunteer to get the voice over the line? How can we non-Indigenous Australians, because we work with lots of corporates, they've got their reconciliation action plans, they're keen to see this get over the line, and what can we do to help? And do you want the help?
Two really big questions, can I say? How long have we got?
We've got 7 minutes.
Okay. All right. I need to actually share. So we're storytellers. Part of our way of being, and actually in my family line, we're storytellers. So I need to share a couple of stories around that and around the question of people being questioned around their identity. And, you know, hello. Now, I haven't actually been questioned around my identity, I think once actually. But that's because I grew up. I knew who I was, I knew my community, I know my family, I know my family lineage. You know, my family's in our native title claim, like it's... So I didn't have some of the questions thrown at, I know my sister, for instance, who came back home when she was 28 and had a different lived experience to ours and is still finding her way home, even though, you know, I've known her since I was 17. She still struggles because she grew up, you know, her first 28 years of her life was with a totally different cultural experience. Her stories are different. My stories are different. So I think for people who have been taken and then coming home, and that adds a layer of complexity, a layer of trauma. And I think, you know, for me as someone within my community, being open to people coming home and what that looks like for them is really important. For the non-Aboriginal mob, I think allowing people to share their identities as they are is really important. When my kids were born, and their father's Wiradjuri fella, and his dad said to me, oh, Ginibi. So it was when my daughter was born and she had blonde, blue eyes. And he said to me, oh, Ginibi, you know, you're going to have to get those proof of Aboriginality certificates for these two. And I went, what? And like, she was literally a couple of hours old. And I'm like, what? And he went, you know, look out, you know, look at that one. She's real fair. And I went, hey, my kids will know who they are. They'll know their bloodline. They'll know their story. They don't need a piece of paper to prove who they are. So I think, you know, yes, the ticking the box is really important for data, particularly. And we know that data is a big issue, particularly in the health sector, around accurate data. And I worked in Aboriginal community health for many years, so I know this is a thing. But it's also allowing spaces for people to share their story and their journeys. Some people know, like, you know who they are, where they're from, regardless of what their skin colour looks like. Other people are coming home, and that also is regardless of their skin colour as well. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I was just going to say my children are Waka Waka and Kalali people, and my daughter's fair and my son isn't. And I do get questions, but never from their mob. And, you know, it's always from that Western sort of avenue that I do get questions. And as a non-Indigenous mother of First Nations children, I'm navigating that space for my kiddies. So it's a learning journey for me, but it's certainly something that I see more so from non-Indigenous people have questions. Their mob, they know, you know, they are connected to their culture, they know their country, they know their community, and they are accepted, both of them. So that's something that I just, when you were talking about your stories, it's something that resonates with me and is an ongoing learning journey for me as well. But in terms of our volunteers as identifying volunteers, we have majority of our volunteers are non-First Nations peoples, but we do not question Aboriginality when we are approached by volunteers. That's not something that we do in our space. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say on that. I think it's not something that we would ever ask from a volunteer. Yeah.
I'll just touch on it quickly, only from the perspective of asking the question, and we've recently recruited to our First Nations advisory group. It's certainly not something that we would ever ask around asking someone to prove that or their identity, but I really think even being asked that question speaks more to the position of the person asking it and the need for cultural education and learning, and then that is a really important process for everyone, every non-Indigenous person to go through. And it's not, I would really say it's not doing a one-off education or awareness course. It's a continuous journey, and that will be through formal learning, but also connecting, making personal connections with community members as well.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any? So,
First question, yeah.
yeah.
That's a huge question, and I don't think a couple of minutes will do justice to it. My advice would be do your deep thinking, your reading, you're listening to the diversity of voices within our community. Our community is diverse, so there will be people like Auntie Violet today, who is a big advocate for the voice. Then there's people like Lydia Thorpe, who is very, very staunch in we need a treaty. So I think listening to the diversity of voices, providing space for that, calling out racism when you see it, because the voice has unleashed a lot of fear about what that will mean and what a change to the Constitution will actually mean. So I think engaging in conversations that will create space for people to reflect on their own biases and assumptions is actually the thing you can do. I think it's really important when we're engaging in big conversations on a national stage that the burden is not then put back on the Aboriginal community to provide the answers, but that every single person goes away and has a deep reflect about, well, what's this stirring up for me? What's my assumptions here? What are my biases? Having the conversations in your own communities. Another really quick story. At the actual apology in 2008, I was standing there with one of my, I think it was White Australia Has a Black History t-shirts on. Anyway, this woman came up to me and she was absolutely exquisite. She would have been in her late 60s. Her hair was just perfect. Her makeup was perfect. She had this silk suit on and she just came, she beelined for me and I'm like, whoa. And she went, I just had to be here. I had to be here today. I've driven here from Mossman. So this was, she'd driven from Sydney to Parliament House. It was, 8 o'clock in the morning at that stage. She said, and she was perfect. And I'm like, oh my God, how did you do it? My head's going, how did you do that? But she said, I had to be here. She said, I'm a Liberal supporter. But when Howard did what he did, I just, oh my God, and I live in Mossman and I'm with the tennis club and I'm with the bowling club and people say things and, what do I do? I think you need to come and talk to people. And I went, actually, you're the person who needs to talk to your friends, to your family, to your community, because you can engage with your community the way I can't. I'll be just seen as some Aboriginal woman who's come in off the street, and normally it's an angry black woman who's come off the street and is going to tell you stuff that you don't want to hear. But you're part of your community. And if you're feeling uncomfortable with what your friends are saying, with what your tennis club, colleagues are saying, then you've got more power to influence them. So that's, I think, sit with, how you're feeling about this, the different voices within our community, and think about what will this mean, with a change to the Constitution. Yeah. Me personally? Okay, so I'm a advocate for me as a sovereign being. I've never ceded my sovereignty. My family has never ceded their sovereignty, and my family has fought. I come from generations of warriors. So where do I sit on it? We were talking about this at lunch, actually. I see the benefit of having a voice to Parliament. I see the benefit of us being in the Constitution, but I also believe that we have not ceded our sovereign rights and that we need to be having truth-telling conversations and we need to be having conversations about treaty. That's my personal opinion. So I can see that this is a thing that could actually shift mainstream Australia in particular, but not to the detriment of having conversations around truth-telling and sovereignty and treaty and what that means for every community, because every community is different and every Aboriginal person you meet will have a different story around that. So that's my personal sort of take on it. I sit probably closer to Lydia Thorpe But when the yes vote comes in, I'll be extremely happy.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Aimee, Ginibi, and Jenna. I think, you know, what's so wonderful about these conversations is that they sort of turn into these truth-telling sessions as well. And it's an opportunity for us to think about a different ontology and epistemology of First Nations community practices, but also the coloniality of terms. Like if we're talking about volunteering conference, then we need to engage with that troubled history as well. And it's never a conversation just about community development, but it's also about sovereignty. And it's also about survival against the settler colonial state. And that's what Indigenous community practices are about. So this is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. And I hope that we can all stay in touch and connect with each other and the presenters. And thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.